What's up, homebrewed Christianity listeners? This is Tripp, and I am sitting on my porch with my best bud, Jeremy Fackenthal. Dr. Fackenthal, what's up?
Hello, what's up?
Well, we're in the middle of adult VBS with Brueggemann, and Manny's like, Tripp, aren't you going to put out a podcast episode? I need an intro. So this is an intro. And in this episode, people are going to hear me and Mickey ScottBey Jones talk to Joerg Rieger and Emilie Towns.
Nice.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. And Joerg and I start off, and we're talking about, let you guess. Let's see, what topics could Joerg Rieger and I talk about?
Probably how much you love money and power.
It's like that, but opposite day. And then Mickey said, Tripp, if we're going to get to talk to Emilie Towns at Wild Goose at a live podcast, then I have like 100 questions I'd like to ask. You don't have to let me talk to her, but I'd like to. Which I thought was peer pressure because she said it like 100 times prior to Wild Goose. So I was like, Mickey, why don't you kick things off with her? She said, well, I could probably talk to her for like 10 minutes. And 40 minutes later, she invited Joerg and I back up, and then like all four of us talked, and it was awesome. So if for some reason you don't know that Joerg Rieger and Emilie Towns are kind of legendary theological ethicists from Vanderbilt University, their divinity school, then now you know. And that's what's going to happen in this episode. So I feel like you should buckle your theological safety belt. What do you think, Jeremy?
I agree. Two of the greatest living theologians. Here we go.
Yeah. And here's the last thing. You may be saying to yourself, Tripp, how come amazing podcasts keep coming to my earbuds? And that's because people join the homebrewed community. And that's how all this happens. It's how Manny, who reminded me, Tripp, give me an intro. He edits this. How does he get paid to edit all the podcasts? People join the homebrewed community. There's one example of what happens. On top of that, you get really sweet bonus things in a few months. And by that, it's a vague statement connected to when we finish building the new website. The members are going to have their own private podcast stream where every week you get a completely additional episode of something that only people that are members get. So if you go to Homebrewed Community, you can sign up. And in the near future, you'll be getting additional goods, and you'll be a part of Philip Clayton and I's ongoing reading group, Epic Reads. But this month, before the Elizabeth Johnson episodes start, I'm doing a 2-session introduction to theology for people that are evangelical that are leaving it behind. Now, I mean, anyone's welcome to join, but if you're in the Epic Reads group, the next 2 sessions are called Epic Questions, because it's a stack of questions people that aren't evangelicals anymore asked, and they're like, well, exactly how are you supposed to think about this? They added up basically to an intro to systematic. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to try to answer questions on the Epic side, thinking, you're like, look, I like Jesus, I've read the Bible, but I also would like to love my lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual neighbors, care for the planet, be down for social justice, and probably not think my Buddhist neighbor's going to hell. Is that possible? And I'm like, yes. Yep. That's what we're going to do. And then I'm not going to tell everyone this, Jeremy, but I'll tell you, Elizabeth Johnson is going to join a session of Epic Reads.
Ooh.
Yeah. And if you don't know who Elizabeth Johnson is, you should really listen to some back episodes. Like, one of the most famous living Catholic feminist theologians.
Yes.
She Who Is changed my life. Page 56 of She Who Is one of my favorite pages of theology.
Agreed.
And
we read that together with Philip Clayton. We
did. It happened. So, go to homebrewedcommunity.com. You can check it out. And, just be ready, because there's more excitement headed your way. Like, the next podcast you listen to is going to be with Kevin Kelly. And if you don't know who that is, it's because you don't keep up with technology. And if you do keep up with technology, you know who it is because he was helped found Wired magazine, and he wrote this book called The Inevitable about the future of technology and how it's shaping everything. But I'm going to say that in the next intro. So here it is. Joerg Rieger, Emily Towns talking with Mickey and moi at the Wild Goose Festival in a hot, sticky tent. So everyone just got a Gustavo Gutierrez card. Now, if for some reason they collected baseball cards as a child and don't know why they should be as excited about this as like the Ken Griffey rookie card, why should Gustavo Gutierrez, should there be theological trading cards, get a sweet one?
Wow, that's a great question. If you haven't heard that name, you really have to check it out, Gustavo Gutierrez. Sometimes people call him the father of liberation theology, but that's really half a joke because liberation theology is not a head trip. It's not theologians inventing crazy stuff. It's people's theologies that people like Gustavo then started writing up, systematizing, making it acceptable in the academy. So that's one thing that he did. Really organizing people at the grassroots. His background is he's Peruvian, really emerging from grassroots communities in conversation with them, young people. So they were doing the sort of things that Wild Goose now is trying to do 40 years ago. And they did it quite successfully, as you may have heard. I remember talking to him once, that was in the 90s. Rosemary and I traveled to Peru to see him. And I said to him, what is the most important thing in liberation theology? If you ask this question, people expect something, like we're going to save the world or we're going to liberate all the oppressed people. And Gustavo said, the most important thing really is evangelization. Evangelization is, what do you mean by that? Well, doing what the gospel is actually talking about. Living the gospel, spreading the gospel, and changing the world in that way. And then he said, well, we also had two other insights. One was the preferential option for the poor. And the other one was that praxis actually shapes the way you think. So it's not just a head trip. Praxis and theory are interrelated. I learned a lot these days talking to Gustavo. But keep in mind, it's really not just trying to do a social project. It's really changing life as a whole and creating life in a way that was, or recreating it in a way that was meant to be.
So when you're introducing liberation theology to students who didn't come in familiar with it because their youth group didn't bring them to Wild Goose or some ridiculous idea like that, where do you begin?
It really depends who I'm talking to. A lot of people come. I taught in Dallas at SMU for the past 22 years before now switching to Vanderbilt. So it's probably going to be a different world. But at SMU, they came, being really afraid and scared of liberation theology. They were worried about the option for the poor. They had probably heard about it because they thought it was partisan. Now you have to take sides. Don't we love everybody? So I'm trying to help people to see that, taking sides, taking the right side of history, struggling not only for the oppressed, but with the oppressed, as the oppressed, is actually a way of liberating everybody and understanding who God is. So in that sense, we're talking about how do we dig deeper into an understanding who God is in our own world. So it's pretty comprehensive, but that's for people who are apprehensive about liberation theology. Other people who think, well, this is an old hat. Of course, these days we're talking about post-colonial theology. We're talking about all kinds of other queer theologies and so on. That's all great. I have to remind that this is sort of a radical step in the development of theology in the last 50 years. That's really unique because it's not just another modern theology. It's a theology that truly understands that we're struggling with life and death issues. And in those issues, we have to take sides and make a difference. So in that sense, what I sometimes say, don't take this the wrong way. I say there's a real difference between liberation theology and liberal theology. Because with liberal theology, oftentimes you're staying somewhere in the middle, which is great for people who, came from a conservative background. I came that way myself. I was raised as a conservative Methodist in Germany. So liberal theology gives you sort of a resting place. You don't feel so bad. You open up. That's great. But liberation theology is really the next step. It's sort of a radical move that you don't really quite get in a lot of our liberal traditions. So it's not just, can't we all get along? It's, let's do something, let's change this thing and be on the right side of history.
So one of the things that I find real fascinating about liberation theology is that it's one of the theologies that comes with a new way to read Scripture and a new hermeneutic. That it highlights how this biblical narrative tells a story where God continually takes sides, which is generally problematic to most liberal first world type theologies, and that God acts in very partisan ways. Now, I remember the first time, and John Sabrina was my introduction to liberation theology. The first time I read Jesus the Liberator, I was mad. And what do 20-year-olds do when they're mad about a theology book? You pretend you smoke hand-rolled cigarettes and go to Waffle House till 2 a.m. and read the Bible verses that they footnote. And annoyingly, he had read his Bible even better than a sword drill champ like me. And I got Bible quoting skills. I just had failed to notice that the big story of Scripture is not one of this amorphous God who makes things, loves everything, and wants equality in this kind of standoffish God is at a distance sense, but a God who's down and in, takes sides, a religion that's not focused up or in, but down and out. And it liberation theology is as much a guide to reading Scripture without sucking for privileged people in the West as it is a school of theology.
That's the way it all started. In the 60s, you had these Latin American movements for liberation, and the people started sitting down and reading the Bible together. They didn't really need expensive biblical commentaries. They didn't really need the theological trade either, because they saw the stuff that was there, and a lot of this was taking sides in moments of conflict. I mean, think of the Exodus, Think of what Jesus is doing. Jesus is taking sides, Not only is he preaching good news to the poor, he's proclaiming woe to you who are rich. And Mary, his mother, joins in that too. So it's really not just Jesus. Paul has some of these sayings too, where God elects those which are nothing, which are, not wise, not smart, not strong, and puts to shame all the rest. That sort of stuff, it doesn't really take a whole lot to see it, unless you have these veils that we have produced. So a lot of our religious education, whether in churches all the way up to theology schools, is to cover up what's really happening. And so when people started to read the Bible, they could see it. I think if we sat down and read the Bible, we could see it. One thing we've done in the last 2-3 years in Dallas before we left was to read the Bible with Walmart workers who are organizing. And those guys and women, none of them white people, they could really see it. They could really catch that pulse. Now, this is the thing about the Bible. It is a collection of a lot of these grassroots stories, oral traditions put together. Now, sometimes they were put together by people with power, and then, you have some complexity. You have some images of God where God is top down, even in the Bible. But a lot of these grassroots traditions, a lot of these people's traditions remain. And what book do you have in world literature that is a people's tradition book? This is why I think these scriptures, whether the Christian Bible or the Hebrew Bible, are so amazing, because you have some stuff there that you don't have to put there. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's already happened. People have already told these stories for thousands of years. And if you connect with them in one way or another, in the midst of the struggle, something happens. That was the experience of liberation theology. And of course, that was never just a Latin American thing. When people say liberation theology, they think, oh, this is just Latin Americans. I would say, no. Look, in the United States, there's, of course, black theology. which also started in a relation to, these conversations. There's feminist theology, womanist theology, and there were some white theologians who also got it. They didn't get a lot of press. One of them, my teacher at Duke, who passed away in '95, Fred Herzog, doing some of that stuff in the midst of the civil rights struggle in North Carolina, and on beyond that.
So I'm interested in your connection between two things, and it could be completely arbitrary. You can tell me. I might edit it out of the podcast, but you could tell me. And the other is that to use as a way of setting up how you understand the shifts in the situation of revelation in 20th century theology. Like if we think of earlier in the 20th century where the dialectic theologians like Bultmann and Barth, you get this no to just natural theology. Because when we did natural theology, you had this essentialized Western male as the archetype for being human. And there are these natural theological conclusions that come out that end up cooperating with genocide and all sorts of horrible things. And Barth says, no, like God tells you who God is in this event of revelation, God's self-testimony. And then you get in the liberation theologians another no that's like, no, like God is revealed in an event and it's on the underside. And one of the things I've always appreciated about your work is the connections that you draw in more progressive theological circles to the insistence of divine revelation as like the place in which we're called not just to understand the story of God as the one who takes sides, but to know that God is still present in those places on the margins and on the other side revealing God's self. And that if we as people of privilege wish to hear from God and receive the blessing, salvation from God, God's exactly where God said God would be. And that situation of revelation in this concept of like deep solidarity, or the way in which you kind of argue for the 99% and that kind of stuff, isn't just a ethics platform. It's a Christian theological assertion around where God is and how God reveals God's self.
This is really a long story, and I don't know, just curious, you guys, have you ever heard of Karl Barth? Who has, so you're all theology nerds, so that's easy. But think of Karl Barth, who was really doing things at an interesting time in European history. The thing about Barth that a lot of people don't know is he probably learned his theology from working people in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes there's conversation, what are all the philosophical influences? And there are many on Barth. That's all fine. But his theology shifts at the moment when he's appointed as a pastor in a small church, not a small church, but a small village church in Switzerland. Savenwil was the village. And he realized that everybody, including the church itself, including the mayor, including everybody else who lived there, assumed that God was on the side of the ruling class. God was on the side of the powerful. And it hits Barth, maybe that's not the case. That is a huge moment in history because for the most part, when people say God, they look up not only to heaven, but to those who have power. They look up to those who are in charge, those who are in control. And they identify God with the dominant power. So Barth in Savenwil with the workers realized there was something else going on. And then Barth really became not only a different sort of religious theologian, he became a socialist, he worked with the unions. All that stuff, of course, has to be covered up because it's way too dangerous. What is he reacting against? Well, there were really two things that people often forget. People realize, Barth is reacting against culture Protestantism. So this is sort of a liberal tradition that felt like God was just like us. There were some people in control, mostly white, middle class, ruling class people who shaped God in their own image. So there was a sort of fun way of make God look like the average German, make God look like everybody in terms of the status quo. That was one thing against which Barth reacted. But then on the other hand was the conservative side. There were conservatives who basically thought they had it all together. They had all the right doctrines. They had the right institutions. And this is who God was, And Barth says no to both things. The conservatives don't have it. The liberals don't have it. There's something else going on that's really surprising. Because God appears in a place where nobody looks, and that's at the margins. For Barth, that's working people. For us today, I think that's where we have to start looking again. That's the book on religion and labor. The 99% of us are actually the ones that have to work for a living. The 1% may also work, but they don't. And so if you start doing this 99% theology, starting to look at the places where it really hurts. So this is why Black Lives Matter is so important. It's not just a social movement. It's also helping us to rediscover where God's actually at work. You know, this is why our work with the Walmart workers was not just social activism. It was really a fundamental theological research project. We want to know what's God actually doing from the bottom up. And this is something that happened in the 20th century in Europe. And that happened again later on with the liberation theologians, and that's still happening. And this is the reason why I finally made up my mind to join the Vanderbilt faculty after 22 years at SMU, because I think Vanderbilt is doing that really well. And if you were here earlier, heard my dean talk, I think she gets it. She didn't pay me to say that. I have to.
Well, so you already know which office is yours?
Well, it's a really small office somewhere far away. So.
Oh. Well, okay. So one other question, and again, this is a one that touches on a number of topics for you just to expound in nerdy fashion. But of late, the last 50, 60 years, there's been a turn in historical Jesus research. So if it was a shock at one point when we discovered Jesus was a first century Jew.
Surprise.
See, you giggled, and some people that didn't know nerds existed, they're like, really? That was a shock? And you're like, yes. Called most of church history.
They thought Jesus looked somewhat like me, which is not true.
Oh, he had better hair, though, Joerg.
I think so.
It was very Swedish.
Better beard.
Blue eyes. Saltine skin. I always thought he looked like a saltine on that one picture, but then I found out it was just because my grandma didn't take care of her Swedish Jesus poster, so it had crinkled. And it made me feel better, because clearly the Son of God wouldn't have dry skin. And anyway, so there was a period that church was like, oh, Jesus is a first century Jew. We got to, wow, that's crazy. Then he talked about eschatology, period. Then there was like a we can't talk about him, period. Because we don't really know anything about the historical Jesus. We weren't so smitten with our historical research school. Then they're like, okay, that was a bit of overreaction. We can make baby steps. And this whole story is going on. But every historical Jesus reconstruction had a really sweet place that Jesus would hang out. Namely, overeducated Westerners would appreciate him at their church if he sanitized better. It was always like this little bitty difference between him and the progressive edge of the church. Then there was a realization that Jesus' prophetic embodiment was one that wasn't just against kind of cultural and social norms, but it was political in Jesus' affront to Roman imperial power. And at that point, this input of historical Jesus research starts to make a lot of us, especially with multiple graduate degrees, uncomfortable. And it makes people whose retirement plans are connected to their mainline Protestant jobs uncomfortable. Because before we wanted to be the intellectuals who were trying to connect like what we really know about historical Jesus and have that empower our faith. And all of a sudden, Jesus could not fit in a good middle-class American box, even with some reasonable twisting. And we had to put on the table how much of our identity is more connected to our flag or our class or our race or gender than our faith. So can you describe what it's like to begin to do theological reflection on Jesus when we can't credibly fit him in any bubble of North American upper middle class ecclesial existence?
That I think that's the real challenge for us, how to de-domesticate Jesus, or Barth at one point uses that term that gets translated as domestication of Jesus. What he really says is the bourgeoisification of Jesus, making Jesus ruling class, making Jesus middle class. And that's really always a bad project. So that happens time and again. One of my books is titled Christ and Empire, and in that book I'm actually talking about how the empire has taken over our images of Christ, our images of Jesus for 2,000 years. It happened at the very beginning. It happened through history. It still happens. And so somebody read, this was my project, and he thought he had to write a book review, and he said, this is really a horrible book, and Jesus in Rieger's account is just terrible. And he says, Rieger is worse than Marx because he has no hope. And I said, well, you probably read the first half of the book description, but there's actually a second half that you haven't read before writing the book review. You can read it all on the back flap of the book. So while on the one hand, empire has taken over our images of Jesus and of Christ for 2,000 years, it has never, that's the second half of that blurb, it has never managed to do so absolutely. And at every point in history, you find this alternative image of Christ, alternative images of Christ, alternative images of Jesus breaking through, creating havoc, creating a difference. So I go through some of these early stories. You've heard of the Nicene Creed, I'm sure. The Nicene Creed is usually seen as an empire creed, but it also has some resistance qualities. If you read the Nicene Creed against the grain, you actually see that this radical Jesus radicalizes God because they're of the same substance, so stuff like that. So the great thing is that throughout history, and even in this historical Jesus research time, you find both traditions. You find an empire tradition, and a lot of the liberal readings of the historical Jesus were empire traditions. But you also find counter-traditions. So early on, you have images of the historical Jesus that were created by working people in Europe and as well in America. This stuff is really exciting, but nobody knows about it. It's going on until this very day. So now we have the Jesus seminar, and everybody thinks this seminar now has the monopoly of Jesus. That's not the case. There are other people who want to understand it. Now, one of the exciting things, just a little tidbit of what we're finding about Jesus today, and this is not an individual who discovered it, but a whole collective, is that Jesus was not only a radical preacher. I thought that for too long myself. That's probably my biggest theological mistake, that Jesus was a radical preacher, without understanding that Jesus also was an organizer. And it's those things in combination that made him dangerous to the Romans. Radical preacher and an organizer. There were other radical preachers at Jesus' time. There was actually another guy by the name of Jesus, the son of Hananiah, who was a radical preacher. The Romans took him in, they beat him up, they let him go. Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph and of God, that guy, not only preaching radically but organizing, became so dangerous that they had to get rid of him. That's a sort of cutting-edge historical Jesus research that's out there right now. If you look at Richard Horsley's work, for instance, and so on, that sort of stuff is really kicking. And it's not should we talk about the historical Jesus or not, but how do we talk about this stuff?
So a last question is the multitude. That's connected, I think, to what you were talking about. And that, for me, when you introduced that thought about Jesus as an organizer, you've done some work in doing some theological development over the character of the multitude in the Gospels that, at least for me, the moment I recognized it, parables, narratives, healings, all took different slants.
So this term actually... right after during the height of the Occupy movement, my colleague Kwok Pui Lan and I wrote a book titled Occupy Religion, in which we pick up this term, the multitude. That was a term that was around in sort of left-wing theory, but we also picked up the fact that this was a term that had been developed in radical theological work. Korean Minjung theology, for instance, had talked about the people, the multitude. There were other theologies. The Latin Americans really helped me understand something. Two of my colleagues, at one point, we wrote a book beyond the spirit of empire. And in that book, these colleagues really hammered home the idea that Jesus was not merely in favor of democracy, but of laocracy or ochlocracy. Now, you have to take a zip. Those are new words, right? So democracy, in the old Greek definition of the term, meant the rule of the demos. Now, the demos were not everybody. It wasn't the people as a whole. It was elite people. Slaves were excluded. Women were excluded. So, we had this in our own U.S. history. Males with property, white males with property were allowed to vote. That's democracy. Laocracy, the Greek term laos means the people, or ochlos, the multitude, the little ones. Those people actually empowering. This is a different project. It goes beyond democracy. It's a sort of grassroots thing. That's really powerful stuff. So this is the multitude that we were talking about, and it's tied to what in the new book we're talking about as deep solidarity. If you want to hear more, just a little plug. We have a session tomorrow at 3:00, I believe, in the Bridge tent. Deep solidarity is helping us understand that more and more of us, the 99%, are in the same boat. We're up against the same problems. The life and death struggles out there are ultimately affecting us all. They're messing up our lives too. And if you're still okay, think about your kids or think about your parents. Probably not so much. And so as we struggle together, we are actually building something new. Now, one more thing about that. Whenever people try to unify large groups, like the people or the multitude, sometimes that happens in a fascist notion where we're all alike. We have to have some sort of patriotism or nationalism that makes us all alike. The multitude or deep solidarity is actually the opposite of that. It's not making us all look alike, but it's putting our differences to productive use. That's what we're talking about. So now all of a sudden, I don't necessarily always have to step back behind who I am, but I can say, as a white male, I have some white privilege, I have some male privilege, I have some middle class privilege. But what if I put that in a different struggle? What if I put that in a different collective? What if I activate that in a way that is actually working against the dominant status quo? What happens when that happens is basically you're deconstructing your privileges. You don't have to divest yourself. You don't have to throw it all away. But when you use it, you're actually changing it. So the multitude here is a very dynamic piece that talks about how we can do things as large collectives while paying attention to those who are affected the most. So paying attention to the black young men who are now being shot. This is why it's Black Lives Matter, not All Lives Matter. Paying attention to that helps us activate, helps us release, helps us make use of some of our differences.
Awesome. So here's what we're going to do. Mickey Jones is going to come up here to have some fun. And Joerg and I are going to have a drink for a minute while Emilie and Mickey have a chat. And then we're all four going to have some fun. Yes. Oh, and new people have walked in. Then you need to make sure you go over and see Josh because you need to take home your Gustavo Gutierrez theological trading card. To not have one is to have a diminished existence. Maybe. Perhaps. I don't know. But if that inspires you to take them. Also, we're doing a giveaway with books. 21 books for the 21st century of theology over there. So you should enter it because it's like $500 of theology books for just nothing. There's other free things that we brought. You text and you can get a 4-day or 4-part workshop that I did with Peter Rollins, Jack Caputo, and Barry Taylor on radical theology for church. So like how you take radical theology and create liturgical practices and stuff. And then there's free stuff if you get Joerg's book that he just told you about. So obviously you should get that and your happy hour beverages. But first, I just got to say something. So when we were talking about doing this, everything homebrewed related, Mickey, our sitting there talking, she goes, oh, that's so good, but you do know I have a few questions I have to talk to Emilie about. And I was like, yeah.
I said Dean Towns.
And then we have an email exchange, details about festival stuff. well, that and I really feel like I should talk to Dr. Towns about some things. And I said, well, we'll make sure that happens. Then I get here yesterday. Well, when am I going to talk to Dr. Towns? And then did you have someone come up and say, hey, that was a very thorough interview you had with Dr. Towns on the podcast. I love that you put it back out. So do you have anything else to talk to her tomorrow, or is Mickey going to do it? And I was like, did she put you up to this, or it was this just...
No, that was just
the Holy
God
Ghost
herself.
And so y'all are going to talk for a bit, and then we'll all talk together. But if you don't know how lucky it is about the conversation you're about to hear, you're welcome in advance. But Mickey's one of the favorite people that works in Partners for all the homebrewed stuff. And when you get done with this, you'll say to yourself, how will she beat Kristen Howerton tonight at the theological mommy battle that'll happen during the podcast? And you say, can you really take out Rage Against the Minivan Mom in a battle? When you get done right now, you'll be like, whatever, she was right there with Emilie Towns. Screw you, bloggers. You can't handle this. I just got womanist at theological happy hour.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm taking Howerton out. Yeah.
I know. She's going to cry. Anyway, buckle your theological safety belts.
Thank you, Tripp. Yeah, so I will totally admit I'm a little nervous because I'm a huge fan. So, okay.
It's okay. You have them written down. So.
I do have some notes. So I have had the pleasure of hearing you speak several times in different settings, which has been really interesting as well. And I live in Nashville, and I just went to seminary, but I didn't go to Vanderbilt because, I don't know, it's Vanderbilt. But we can talk about that later. Are there some scholars? Never mind. Okay, we'll talk about that later. But I would love to talk a little bit about womanist theology and about your work, because I identify as a womanist, and the way I put it is that I found a home in womanist theology. It is the place where kind of when I finally read about it and heard about it and started to dig in, it just clicked. I was like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. And I feel like that's how a lot of people feel when they come to it, how a lot of black women feel when they uncover it. So I would love to hear about your journey into womanist theology and your kind of, if that's how it is for you, kind of a home for you, and you do the ethics, with it, and if you feel like that goes hand in hand, or what is womanist theology for you?
That's several questions. Yes. So let me start with one, and then if I don't address all of it as I'm wandering around, pull me back. How many people know what womanist theology is? Oh, this is better than usual. All right, short version, history version. 70s rolled along. Feminist theology becomes a major force, or starts to become a major force. Black theology starts to become a major force, particularly in the United States. I'm talking, this is a U.S.-based movement, by and large. And as that happened, also was the first wave of black women coming into seminary education. And I was in that wave. And one of the things that we noticed was the black men talked about black men in black theology, and the white women talked about white women, usually middle class and straight, in feminist theology. But there was no place for black women who held a communal identity and needed to be in solidarity as a community of men and women because of the ongoing threat of annihilation that was not rhetorical, it was actual, and we only see it more so today. And we understood that the black church often is one of the more sexist institutions within the black community. So it was, where do we go? Both of those theological formulations were not helping us make sense. And they certainly weren't expressing the kind of religious worldview that my grandmother and my mother and countless black women, either intimately involved in the church or just drive-by church folk, were expressing in their daily life. So I didn't see me there. And I was not alone. There were a lot of us who did not see ourselves there. It's Dolores Williams, who was one of the real godmothers of the movement, once said, feminist theology and black theology, but particularly feminist theology, was like being a size 16 and trying to fit into a size 8 dress. You can do it, but it looks strange. So Alice Walker, about 84, came along with the term womanist in her book of essays, In Search of Our Mother's Garden, and subtitled it Womanist Prose. And her editor said, "What's that?" And Alice came up with the 4-part definition of womanism. One is intergenerational knowledge being passed generation to generation, older women, black women to younger black girls, and black girls also asking more questions than the adults would say were good for them. In other words, they couldn't answer them. The second definition, part of the definition, was the diversity of blackness along color lines, along race, along gender lines, along sexuality lines, and saying, this is not the first time that we've been caring about the community. It's been a history of folks like Harriet Tubman. And so contemporary things saying we're going to save the community, read your history. You are not the first. The third definition looked at women's bodies, black women's bodies, as not fitting the norm, which very few women anywhere fit the ideal norm of what a woman is supposed to look like. We got curves, we got things bulging here and there, and ends with loves herself regardless. And the fourth part of the definition is womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. And that was a direct critique of white feminism, white middle-class feminism, to be specific. Also in the 70s, Union Theological Seminary in New York had a critical mass of black women. They took Walker's definition and said, what would this look like theologically? So it's one of the few times in theology that we can say, a movement within theology started on this date, in this place, with these people, and we know it, and it's not a question. And so it's been growing ever since. One of the things I had to do, I wasn't in New York, I wasn't at Union, I was sitting in Chicago, Illinois, and I was watching the events and going, this makes some sense. But I was, at that time, and this is now the late 80s, using the term Afro-feminist. Because I didn't want to use a term I didn't know anything about. So I knew about womanism, I heard about it, people, womanist, but I had never sat down and said, what is this? So the summer before I started teaching full-time, I spent the summer reading all that there was, and at that point there wasn't a lot, but there was enough. And by the end of the summer, I said, I can use this term. Because part of what's going on in womanist thought is putting the experiences of black women in the center of all questions, and then spinning out and saying, how does this experience affect race? How does this experience affect class? How does this experience reflect gender and sexism and sexual orientation and militarism and on and on and on? What is it that black women have said historically about these things? Because we've been talking. The question is, was anybody listening? And so for me, then, as a ethicist, I use what I call an interstructured analysis that begins with race, gender, class, sex, and sexuality to look at everything I look at. So when I looked at the healthcare system, I just put it through the grid. And it helps me go from particular to maybe universal. My first move is not to try and be universal. I think universal claims, before you've understood the particular, usually drive instances of oppression and discrimination. So I want to start with the particular and then grow it out, to talk about people's stories, to hear where they're going, where they've come from, how it makes meaning for them. And then maybe we'll see the linkages with each other and not be these strangers.
Well, and I think that's why womanist theology resonated so deeply with me when I first found out what it was, because it allowed me to acknowledge that I was doing theology from within my body, from my history, from where I come from. So, but, you know, there's this talk about, you know, how womanist is, you know, segregated out. Like we often talk about just theology, then there's womanist, then there's feminist, then there's liberation, then there's whatever. So what are your thoughts on that kind of idea that you can somehow do theology outside of your body? You know, and because that's what I thought was so beautiful about womanist, is we just go ahead and acknowledge that that we're coming from a particular place. Do you think that's becoming more of a thing we're talking about, is that yes, all theology is coming from a particular place, and let's just go ahead and admit it?
Some people are, and most people aren't. Okay. There's schools like Vanderbilt, Union in New York, Claremont in California, PSR, Bay Area schools, where folks are often really clear that theology begins somewhere within the self, and it's not universal. There's nothing universal. I mean, Joerg just explained where Karl Barth got his theology from. We think it's neutral and universal, but he got it in the community where he was working. It's just that he was a white dude and in Germany, and therefore it must be universal. No. And so for me, it's always been a question of how honest are we being about how we think about God, how we make meaning. And to think that you actually start by saying, you know, God told me is something less than someone like a Tillich or a Barth or a Moltmann or a Hauerwas or whomever, that God didn't talk to them that way. They just like to say, well, I think within the universal scheme of the... They're like, please. It is stuff you are getting out of your own experience.
Right. So I've had people ask me, can a white dude do...
I knew it.
Right?
I knew this question.
So they've asked, right?
Ask the question.
Can a white dude do womanist theology? Right? Like, what do they do with it?
Yeah. When I get that question and I often get it in workshops and with some of my students, but the students at Vanderbilt have heard what my answer is going to be, so they don't ask me anymore. But, as an ethicist, I'm a Niebuhrian. H. Richard Niebuhr, not Reinhold. I'm a Niebuhrian. I find his understanding of responsibility and a response ethic, I'm just shot through with that. And I'm not even sure where it came from, but I got it. I do know where it came from. I went to the University of Chicago, and there was James Gustafson, and that's where I began to say, oh, yeah, I think that, and that. Nuburian? Okay, that's what I'll be. But I just thought I was being faithful. So when I get the question, I say, I'm a Nuburian. I am never going to be a German pietist background, first generation, second generation man. It's just not going to happen. But what I do is I find the methodology helpful. And I try then to integrate it into what I'm thinking and doing. So, can you be a womanist? No. Can you use womanist methodology? Yes. You can decide that you want to use an integrated race, gender, class, sex, sexual orientation analysis to do your theological and ethical work. You can decide to do that. But the one thing, and I found this very helpful from Katie Cannon, when she was working with a group of East Indian women in India, and they all wanted to be womanists. And they said, what must we do? How can we be? And she said, until you can stand with the darkest woman among you, you can't be a womanist. And I said, oh, well, we can't be a womanist.
Wow.
Dalit culture was something they could not go there with. And so when I used to teach in Brazil regularly, Brazilian feminists, particularly Brazilian Afro-feminists, were really intrigued by the notion of womanist. And I said, I can't tell you whether you can be that or not. You have to decide if, given this set of things, if this makes sense in your cultural, political, and theological world. And they decided no. But they could be womanista sometimes, but more often they became feminists who included racial analysis, where before it was just gender analysis. Because they had been, and this was the early 2000s, they were still in the myth of Brazilian colorblindness. And I said, I can't tell you whether you're racist or not, but when the darkest among you, when the power in the press, in the media, outlets, in government, in the businesses, in banks, are all lighter-skinned people. In the U.S., we call that racism. You have to decide what you call it here.
Yeah. And
now there's a movimiento negra that is emerging for the first time. Hopefully will take root. Yeah. But black Brazilians who outnumber U.S. blacks have never been able to sustain a black liberation movement in that country.
Yeah, the suffering is huge there among the black Brazilians. Where I've found the most resonance has been with indigenous women. I find that they often will include black women, other women of color, in their theologies and in their scholarship. And while, again, they don't claim to be womanists, they have other words that they will use to describe their theology. But it's a very similar type of theology. And often, one scholar that I'm really influenced by is Andrea Smith. And so.
Wow, woman.
Yes. And, so brilliant. And you both talk quite a bit about health. Right? And that's a very, particular and, physical, it's definitely in your body. And also, I think sometimes people don't see that as a theological concern, the health and wellness of a people. And so is that something that you kind of deal with more as an ethicist, or do you feel like that's equally an ethical and a theological concern to be discussing our health?
My partner is a theologian, and she tells me all the time that the false line I draw between theology and ethics is not helpful. So, with that in mind, as an ethicist, I think that it is both a theological problem and a moral problem to think somehow that our bodies are exempt from the grace of God, and that we are not, that we somehow get to take a pass on our own health or the health of others because it's too social, it's too medical, it's too something, when in fact body and spirit go together. It's how we live into that dualism of body and spirit that is not helpful. And so for me, isn't there a phrase somewhere, the body is the temple of the soul, something like that? I don't understand our health as being anything other than a theological issue. How are we? Who are we? How are we treating our bodies? What is it that we do that we overwork ourselves, don't see our families, and then say we're holy? When we're creating brokenness every day in the way we treat ourselves as physical individuals, that somehow gets disconnected from our spiritual lives. So for me, I want to hold it all together.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite books or writings of yours is Breaking the Fine Rain of Death. And I was a doula, a birth doula, and for many years, and did lactation care and just kind of that full mother-baby care. So, you know, and now, so you were talking about that. When was that published? You remember? Because maybe you should do. Okay, I think it's time for a new edition.
Yeah, everybody can tell me I need to do an edition of this and a new edition of that. I'm like, no, you all write it.
Part 2. But it's interesting because then recently Melissa Harris Perry was at Vanderbilt, and then I heard her another time at I think when we were in New York for Revolutionary Love Conference, and she, now she's talking quite a bit about even the birth, the issues with our stuff that's going around birth and infant mortality and mother mortality for Black women and women of color. And even though you have raised this issue both theologically and ethically, that dualism persists. It persists kind of in all of our theologies, it seems. Do you think that is just a resistance to, again, it's centering that kind of white male theology versus, actually doing something based on our bodies and how we live out, that's what you're calling for is a lived theology, right? And there seems to be a large resistance to the idea that we actually have to live out our theologies. I think if we can't live out our theologies, they're worthless. And that what you're calling for by, and even in this political season, right? Like, there is this way that we separate, kind of who we are as religious or, spiritual beings from the way we vote, from the way we, build our institutions. And seems like that's what you're really calling for is a lived theology, practical theology, even though we want to then separate that out too.
No, I think I am. I think that, I don't understand how we think a theology can be so ethereal that it has no practical application. Those kinds of theologies scare me because what they do is they create, whether intentionally or not, these false paradigms of what humanity is all about, and then none of us can live into them. And then we're less than, and therefore we are subject to a hierarchy of who's more less than or more than each other. And we do it with our bodies. We do it around color. We do it around gender. We do it around sex and sexuality. We do it around national origin. I mean, we just do it over and over again. And health becomes one of those casualties in the midst of it. So for me, I want to say, put a pin in that action because part of what we're doing is creating the next generation of ists. There are the racists, there's the sexists, go down the list. We are creating that next generation. I really don't want to stand on that side of history.
Well, thank you so much. This has been an amazing time and kind of like living one of my dreams to sit up here with you. And we're going to do some more fun stuff here. We're going to bring Joerg back up. And
I think everyone should give a hand to your dreams.
Woo!
Like, anyone with nerdy dreams like that, like, you should get claps for it. I mean, other people's dreams aren't nearly that cool. You know, like when you're in Pirates of the Caribbean. Or you got to do the voice of Mater for Cars. My son had like 6 sets of tubes when he was little, and he had lots of ear infections and only slept if Dad held him upside down almost while rocking and watching Cars. So I've like fallen asleep to that and had lots of dreams where I was Mater.
Beep, beep. Beep, beep.
Have y'all ever cried at the end of Cars? It's nothing but an empty cup without your friends, and he's pushing them across the line.
See, you still have little people. It's been a while since I've watched that. Sorry. They watch things like Mean Girls now and Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt. That's what we watch.
So
that's it.
So we have like, I don't know, like 20 minutes or something.
Yeah.
So Mickey, let's play the softball game.
Okay.
You don't know what it is because I just made it up while you were talking.
Fantastic.
It's where we pick a really hip theological word and throw it out. And the masters of nerdiness right here both will talk about it so that their work connects to the word we throw out. And the word will likely, short of you currently being in theological education, require you to participate in happy hour excitement. Luckily, this will be on the internet later. So if you have to get a refill to fully participate in the last 20 minutes, because participation is an essential part of ecclesiastical communion, then you can get a refill. All right, so the first word after these conversations, like womanist theology, and then you have like discussions around class. I think I want to have a giant softball tossed across the middle of the plate called intertextuality.
That's a softball?
I hope you mean intersectionality.
Oh, wait, that's the one he told me to say. Intersectionality.
Much better. Much better.
I don't know anything
Look,
about
the setup was pretty good. Hold on. That will all get edited out. The magic of the podcast. In the first words, clearly, like I was telling Joerg before he rudely interrupted me, intersectionality.
Reel it back. Reel it back. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, it's pretty much the same thing. Anything that starts with inter talks about the interrelationship of things. So if it's intertextuality, I guess you're talking about how texts relate to each other and how you read between the lines, perhaps. Intersectionality, I think, is more interesting to us here because it brings together the sort of things that we're all concerned about, namely race, gender, sexuality, class, various other factors. And that to me is the important discussion to be had, because normally the way the dominant system divides and conquers is, it makes some people talk about, well, you can talk about, perhaps women, you can talk about race issues, I can talk about class issues, and then it's seen as something else. Sometimes we talk about it as the Olympics of oppression, and then people say, well, this is where I'm, more oppressed, or this issue is worse than the other issue. So intersectionality is a way of bringing it all together and thinking about how does one affect the other.
It's a term I use sparingly because I like interdisciplinary and integrated better, but they all mean the same thing, is that you're using a matrix to look at something. For me, and that matrix helps me see how complicated the connections are between the forms of oppression we're dealing with and the topics we look at.
You thought of a
Do I
softball?
have a softball? No, I haven't thought of one yet.
Well,
Come
then
back to me.
I have one. Last week, the interview I did with Sally McFay came out, and a couple of people had sent questions in. And one of the questions that someone to get in was a kind of like newly open to feminist thought, grown-up conservative Pentecostal, and was like, how do I figure out what in the world's going on the DL until I know how to talk about it without my friends shaming me and quoting Bible verses? And Sally, because she said, I'm old, I might only be able to talk for 45 minutes. And we're about an hour and 40 in at this point. Says, well, it doesn't really, there's lots of different avenues in to the big insight that theology is about embodiment first. And I thought to myself, I've read way too many books not to have heard that line. So I'm interested. If you had a giant theological softball to do with whatever you want, and it said embodiment first on it, what pops up? Or home runs out. I don't know, whatever the softball analogy is.
A second word comes to mind, materiality. And that is, we are what we talk about. And getting a strong sense of understanding that theories are wonderful, but if they can't be grounded in people's lives, then I think they can turn into dangerous constructs.
I sometimes remind my students that you cannot think just from the neck up, because your brain is connected to everything else. So in that sense, this idea of doing stuff without embodiment is just an illusion. Unfortunately, this is the illusion that the dominant ruling class, usually white males, have told themselves. That's how I was trained in seminary, that's many years ago now, but that was the idea. Materiality, I think, is really the crucial thing. Some of us are now working on a topic that's called the new materialism. There's an edited book out by that title. Check that out. And it's sort of not just talking about matter as such, but it's embodied matter, active matter. What you do, your practices are part of that material reality, and that helps you think. The philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach once said, little advice there, I guess, had these aphorisms. Don't think as a thinker, but as a living being. And that sounds so harmless that you could write it on a Hallmark card. Don't think as a thinker, but as a living being. Unfortunately, what's happening in most of the academy is people are trained to think as thinkers and not as living beings. So those of us who work in a different paradigm, and heard Emilie's story of womanist theology. I mean, my own theology is really this sort of trying to get this embodied work back. Think as thinkers and think as living beings and not as thinkers.
I got one. All right. So in movement spaces, we often talk about the idea of solidarity. What about the thought of theological solidarity? Do you see that as a thing? Do you see it as something that is impossible? Again, we were talking about doing theology from your own body and where you come from. So how do we do theology side by side? So you two sit up here.
I think it's possible, but it's very hard to pull off because we want to move towards being nice or reconciled before we've done the hard work of truth-telling and repentance. If we can get to a place where we're able to look at the realities of who we are, where we've been, and where we're going, and make a decision that we're going to stand with the least of these, and then live our lives in that way every day, maybe not successfully, but at least we're trying, then I think we do have the hope of theological solidarity. But it's not a solidarity of sameness. It's a solidarity that understands that as thinking, feeling beings, we got a lot of stuff we bring to the table that should be cherished.
I think that's the important point, not a solidarity of sameness, because that is always the danger, that we want to make everybody either look alike or, talk like we talk. That happens in the theological classroom a lot. So if you studied under Paul Tillich, you then talk like Tillich, that's not really helpful. But I've seen this theological solidarity actually happening in the actual struggle. So in Dallas, for instance, when we worked with the religion and labor piece, we had one of the most liberal churches, and we had a fairly conservative evangelical mega church, non-denominational church, join us. And the pastors were part of the movement, and they were, reading the Bible with these Walmart workers, sometimes together. The liberal pastor was really appalled that the evangelical pastor was using male God language, right? And the evangelical pastor sometimes wondered whether the liberal pastor was even a Christian. But at the same time, these guys, and these were two guys, not that all of them are guys, but thank God, right? But these folks were ultimately developing a rapport and a way of working together. Not that the differences didn't matter anymore, but they were able to contribute something positive to the struggle. So I think any solidarity that's worth its salt is happening in the struggle itself, and then you can have these conversations. The same is true for interreligious dialogue. If it's in the struggle, it's great. If it's just people sitting around a round table, it's really boring, I tell you.
So I was talking with Adam Clark the other day, and Adam Clark's a black theologian that works Xavier, and he's part of the Homebrewed book series, right? And we became friends and had conversations for a while. And this summer, one of the students, the hatchery where I work, each student picks like up to 1,000 pages of reading, and I read along with them, and then they write papers. And one of them picked all black and womanist theology. And if you are a very white, straight male guy reading it and then having one-on-one conversations, they easily become personal. And I told her I said, Adam said he would talk to you. So they Skyped. And they talked. She comes back, and I went and verified this with Adam secondhand. But I thought, oh, that'll preach. Which is sadly what preachers do every time they hear a really cool quote from a friend. You write it on a Post-it pad and save it till you preach a sermon. And she was talking about how, as a multiracial family, to introduce black theology, what it means so much to one partner and the other's white, and how you pass that on to kids. And Adam told her, you have permission to pause as long as they need after you say God is black. So softball's God is black. And what does talking theologically look like after that pause as American theologians in the 21st century?
Well, that's a quote from James Cone, who himself is very black, and the seen as the father of black theology in the United States. And one of the things that Cone has said more clearly over the years is that when people first hear that and read it, they miss the fact that he's talking about metaphorical blackness, not physical blackness. And it is very easy to miss that fine point in early Cone, because I don't think he made it. But he thinks he did, but that's another story.
Or 5 dissertations.
Yeah.
Beyond ontological blackness.
And then Victor Anderson comes along and...
Also Vanderbilt.
Yes. Also Vanderbilt. Comes along and disputes it, and then moves into Western European theologians and philosophers. But what Cone is trying to get to when he says God is black, and those who have read Cone closely and are quoting it and intending what he said, because some people actually do believe it's a physical blackness, he's trying to get at the fact that God stands on the side of the oppressed. God does not delight in oppression, and God wants us to live out of being oppressors into being liberators and reconcilers. And so that's what God is black means for Cone. When I first saw it, I thought, no, I can't go there with you, brother. That was in the 70s, and I was like, no. But what I did get from that was a way to begin to reconceive my understanding of the God I had been carrying in my head that I didn't even realize was there, who was white and had white hair and white eyebrows and a white beard and was stern looking and looked down upon us, and was male. So what Cone's aphorism did was help me move towards to being much more of someone who leans into the Holy Spirit as opposed to Jesus or God, because that for me is the way I experience God, as a force moving in creation.
What's really important when we say that God is black is not to assume that God can simply morph in any of these forms. So saying that God is white is not the same thing. You know, a nice liberal approach, of course, would be say, you know, God is black and white and brown and green. The reality is that God actually takes sides. And I think that's what Cone was talking about. God takes the side of the oppressed. And when that happens, not only does God come down from heaven somewhere, but God's already there. You know, God is with the oppressed in such a way that it doesn't let God unaffected. I mean, your image of God, like what Emilie just said, your image of God changes. And not just your personal image, but I think theology cannot not go back behind that and say, well, that was just one moment. We now have to deal with it. There was a joke, remember that probably first day in seminary, that was early 80s in Germany, that people were telling probably about Karl Barth or one of these great theologians who went to heaven and finally got to see God, you know, and then came back. And, you know, when colleagues asked, what's God like? He would say, well, she's black. And we thought that was a really good joke because, of course, God could be anything. So, well, that's great. You know, for a liberal, you can say God's black, God's white, God looks like me, God looks like somebody else. That's not the point. The point is, and I think that's part of where that joke is actually helpful, God is embodied in these places where we least expect it, where we don't pay attention. And when we start paying attention, that gets relevant for everybody. So my God, my Jesus, you know, in that sense, I much prefer the black female God in Jesus to, you know, what my tradition would have seen as a white God.
How many minutes we got? Oh, we're out of minutes? Oh, we got 2 minutes.
Well, sort of.
So
we're
this
really
one
supposed to be done before.
They only get 40
ends.
seconds each.
Okay.
And it's a real easy word called polydoxy.
I'm going to pass because my spouse helped create it.
Oh.
So I have to be careful what I say now because the spouse of my dean created it.
I know, but there's an hour and 20-minute interview about it on the website, so...
This is actually a trick question for you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well,
Yeah.
then let me
You
go
didn't
ahead.
know there's a bigger office that opened up, but she hasn't decided.
No, I mean, I think a lot of the struggles, you know, polydoxy, of course, what you hear in the background is orthodoxy. Oh, I see 1 minute. That's going to get difficult. If orthodoxy means, you know, looking at God only from one perspective, and one perspective is right, that usually is the trick of the dominant system. It wants you to believe one thing. There is no alternative is the slogan of empire. Margaret Thatcher coined it in the 70s. that sort of theology is never a good one. So I'd rather go with this poly of something. And then we can talk about what does that mean? How can we still have strong beliefs that take sides, that change the world? That's what I want to talk about. And I think it can be done with that framework.
That was great. And you're still employed. So
Did he pass? Did he pass?
Yeah.
Okay.
There was a series, I guess, 6 years or so on Homebrewed where Laurel and John Tatominal and Catherine Keller all did polydoxy episodes. And I don't even remember who gave the definition, but my favorite was polydoxy. It's the idea that the body of Christ theology should be at least half as diverse as the actual living body of Christ in the world.
This podcast is sponsored by Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a theological school that offers Christian education in service of intelligent, just, and compassionate religious and civic communities. They welcome students to a safe space for truth-seeking conversation about the Bible, Jesus, and faithful living. They have on-campus and distance learning options. Go check them out at www.wherefaithleads.com.